Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. It's Tori. Today I want to talk about some chonks. I want to talk about some chonky books, and as we know in fantasy, there's a lot of those. There are so many, not only chonky books, but just chonky series in general. Today I wanted to go through a list of the chonkiest chonks that I have read in the last few years, and I wanted to just kind of go through and talk about whether or not I thought that particular read was worth the page count, because I know that it can be really hard to decide whether or not you want to commit to a big chonky series or a big chonky book. And I find personally, and please let me know down in the comments how you feel about this, I find that it's really make or break for me, like with pretty much any book, but especially with these chonky ones. If I don't love it, it is such a drudge to get through to the end of the book. And I do tend to DNF books on a fairly regular basis. I do try to give books, the benefit of the doubt and try to give it as much as I possibly can before I decide to DNF. However, on the opposite side of that, if I fall in love with a setting and the characters and the story that's being told, I want more of it, right? In our favorite series, those pages are so precious, and we love every single moment we get to spend with those characters, and I love when they're longer books, because that just means that I have more time to stay with these characters before it inevitably ends. And that is the most bittersweet feeling, right? When you get to the end of one of those really chonky fantasy reads or any genre read, and it's over, and you've read the whole thing, and you know the whole story, and that's the sweet part of it, and the bitter part of it is that now it's over, and you can never read it again for the first time. So the first one that I'm going to start off with is a paltry 784 pages, and that is Until the Last by Mike Shackle. This is book 3 in his Last War trilogy. This is a military fantasy, and it is so gritty and real and just, it's so good. And there are some phenomenal female characters in this series. Why that's such a cool thing is because I often feel like military stories, when they're fictitious, tend to kind of caricature female military characters, which drives me absolutely bonkers, or they're just not there. And either one of those options aren't my favorite, and I feel like Mike Shackle just did a fantastic job showing the roles of real women who were thrown into this invasion scenario and trying to protect the people that they love and overcome their own fears and going through the same things anybody would go through in a battle scenario. The first book in the series was hands down my favorite of the 3. I absolutely loved that first book so much. It's one of the most potent intros to a trilogy I think I've ever read in my life. And the direction that Shackle chose to take with the story as we meandered through the trilogy wasn't really my cup of tea per se. I really enjoyed a lot of the aspects of it, but I did feel like it started to meander a little too much, especially toward the third book. So in this case, I would say yes with a caveat. And again, that's kind of a personal choice for me, where I felt like this meandered a little bit too much. And I think part of that literally just came down to the fact that I would have loved to see the series go in a slightly different direction, but that's not my choice because it's not my series. So overall, really love this series. I do feel like it was a bit meandery in the third book here, and maybe a little bit in the second book too. But all in all, I think that Shackle definitely gives you characters that are fully worth every page that he writes about them. The next one that I'm going to talk about is not a fantasy book, and it's a book that I really haven't talked much about on my channel, and I'm not going to talk much about it here because it makes me very angry when I think back to it. But it is one of the longest books that I have read, and that is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. Okay, so what I'm going to say about this book is, was it worth the page count? That's why we're here. Was it worth the page count? No. I do think that there were pieces of this book that I appreciated. I do not think it needed to be as long as it was, and this book makes me angry only because, in my opinion, this is my personal opinion, okay, you can disagree or agree with it as you choose, I feel like it fetishizes trauma, and that made me very angry as reading this book. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about it, because this was one of the few books that I just really don't want to discuss a whole lot on booktube, but it ended up making this list, so I'm just going to include it. And I'm going to say that I think that it really did not need to be 800 pages. I feel like it could have been much more potent if it was told in 400 to 500 pages and cut out a lot of the unnecessary bits of it. So this one I'm going to give a no, not worth the 800 pages. Next up is a classic. We're going to go all the way back to the roguish motley crew that so many people have loved over the years, and that is The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. This book was a book that I read because my husband absolutely loves it. He is a big fan of a lot of classics, and he reads more of them than I do. And this was one of his absolute favorite books. And so of course I had to read it. I love this mass market paperback, you guys. Look at this brick. You could literally start the foundation of a house with this book. I'm not entirely sure if this is true of Dumas, and I would invite any classic scholars to chime in the comments section. I know with some of the classic writers like Dickens, they were paid to kind of serialize their novels, and that's one of the reasons why you get these many, many chapters, and they're kind of padded with a lot of descriptions and prose, like extra things. And part of that was because they were getting paid by the chapter, and so they would kind of drag out the story a little bit longer for that. This one, I'm not sure if that was the case. There were definitely a couple of sections that, felt a little bit slow. But honestly, this book was so much more accessible than I expected it to be. And I really fell in love with these characters so much, with the exception of D'Artagnan. I am not a fan of D'Artagnan. I can't stand him as a character, and I would be totally happy if it was just the Three Musketeers and D'Artagnan wasn't part of the story. But that's neither here nor there. For all of you D'Artagnan fans out in the world, I'm sorry if I'm hating on your boy, but I'm not a fan. But overall, man, like what a classic. This is such an incredible classic. Some classics you read and you're just like, oh my gosh, really? Like, why does everybody love this so much? This is one of those classics that I feel like I can really get behind and say I can 100% understand why this has been so beloved throughout the centuries since it was written. And it's a beautiful story. It's a great motley crew. It's got some great humor in it. There's some really funny stuff in here. And it's just the heartwarming camaraderie of the characters. And there's some great villain work in this story. So overall, I'm rambling, but 100% worth the page count on The Three Musketeers. All right, next up, we are going to go to Robin Hobb, because I have finished Assassin's Quest. Now, I don't think this is the longest book in the Realm of the Elderlings. I'm pretty sure it's not, actually. But this is book 3 in her original Farseer trilogy, which is book 1 if you're starting the Realm of the Elderlings. And I remember really, really loving this trilogy. I read it quite a few years ago now, and I know that Assassin's Quest kind of gets some polarizing opinions thrown out about it on the internet, but I personally really enjoyed it. And this one did kind of meander a little bit, but I liked it. I actually was okay with that. Like, Robin Hobb is one of those authors that I feel like could, write you a scene where she's just describing a room with a tea kettle and things, and it would be really, it would immerse you and it would pull you in. And she has a beautiful talent for that, where she can make a lot of things really interesting that I think under the hand of a lot of other writers would not be. This is one that I personally don't get the hate of Assassin's Quest and when it comes up, and I do think I'd be interested to reread it to see how it feels on a second pass. But overall, I would say this one is fairly worth the page count, and the Farseer trilogy in general, I think, is a great start to her epic magnum opus series, and I highly encourage people to try it out. The next one is a book I don't own a physical copy of anymore, and I read these, I don't even know, years and years and years ago, long before I had a booktube channel. That is A Feast for Crows from A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. This is book 4 in the series, and I think Feast for Crows not sure, you know, I'm not super in tune with the A Song of Ice and Fire booktube scene, but I do know that Feast for Crows sometimes gets a little bit of flack. And I'm not really sure why, to be honest, because I thought it was pretty good. I do think that one of the struggles I had with A Song of Ice and Fire is it is one of those series that just feels like nothing is ever going to go right. Nothing has ever, like, I remember putting the books down and just feeling really depressed afterwards for long stretches of time, and that didn't really change depending on which of the books I was reading, and I think it got subsequently worse as I went through the series. I do think that Martin utilizes his page counts really, really well. There are so many characters in this series, but one of the things I will say about Martin is that he uses a large cast of characters, but I think he does it in a way that's a lot more accessible than a lot of other fantasy series I've read with a lot of characters, where each one feels so fully realized and interesting and has their own very distinct feel when you're reading them on the page, that it isn't as hard, I think, to pick back up when their new sections or chapters comes along. And that's impressive because it is a huge cast of characters over so many different countries and nations and cultures. So, I mean, regardless of how I feel about the series overall, I definitely have to hand it to Gurm for really having some incredibly distinct characterization, and that is a feat. So yeah, I mean, I still think if this is if that's the kind of story you're into. So yeah, I definitely think that, again, I would say that he earned his page count for sure. I don't feel like they are a slog. They're not, there's a few sections in the series that maybe are a little bit slower, but overall, these read pretty quickly. I remember binging them really fast when I got into the series years ago. So I guess Gurm is another one we're gonna say, yep, it was worth the page count. All right, guys, we're moving up to the really big chonkers here at the bottom of my list, and the first one is from one of my favorite fantasy series of all time, and I haven't even finished it yet, and I can easily say that, and that is Memories of Ice, which is book 3 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Now, I don't believe that Memories of Ice is the longest book in the series, but it is the longest one in the series that I have read, coming in at a very well-padded 1,187 pages. Now, Malazan is a tough one, honestly, when it comes to talking about whether or not the page count is earned, because obviously I would say yes, 100%. I think Erikson is a brilliant writer. These are definitely books that require you as a reader to really commit, right? To commit to the read. This is not a series that you can read kind of distractedly. And because of that, it can definitely feel like a lot when you get into these higher page count books. I really loved them. I didn't binge them as fast as some of the other bigger series that I have read, but part of that is just because it is such a vast world and there are so many details involved that it does kind of require you to slow down and really soak in what you're reading. Now, that being said, I know that Malazan also gets a bad rap as a series that's just way too complicated for anybody to read, and it's very intimidating. It's at the top of everyone's like most intimidating fantasy series lists. And I think that that's fair to a point, but I also think that it is unfairly judged in that way because trust me, you guys, if I'm reading this series and I'm getting things out of it and loving it as much as I am, I promise you that you can do it as well. Like, I am not a super high level intellectual reader when it comes to figuring out all the details and noticing all the things and keeping everything straight. So if I can read it and love it, I think that's a testament to Erikson's power of characterization and how immersive his world building is, because despite the fact that I don't always know exactly what's going on, I love these characters, I love the story, and there are so many sections of these books that just hit you between the eyes and are just incredible. So do I think that Erikson earns his page count? Absolutely, but be ready to commit. All right, we're down to the last two chonks on my list. And second to last, coming in at 1,233 pages. 1,200 pages of fantasy novel is Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson. Now, this is book 3 in his much beloved Stormlight Archive that has just been dominating the fantasy genre for quite a while now. And I have read the entire series, all 4 books that are out right now, plus the novellas that go in between. Way of Kings and Words of Radiance were, as the first 2 books in the series, I would have said yes a lot more quickly to when it comes to earning page count. I still think they're a little bit long. I honestly do. I don't think that they needed to be as long as they were. I would say that I don't think Oathbringer needed to have 1,200 pages. I really don't. I didn't think that... I didn't think it was necessary. And I know all of the Sanderson fans are probably going to take ire with that, which is fine. But I feel like these books are a little bit too big. I think that they kind of got away from themselves a little bit. And while I still really loved the story reading it, and I love a lot of the characters in this series, I do think that Stormlight Archive books are a tad long. Let's have a round of applause for the book on the bottom of my stack here on the table. And this is the longest book that I'm aware of that I have ever read. And this is one that I read with a couple of friends of mine in early 2023. And I have a dedicated review for it. There is a TV series that recently came out that I've been hearing amazing things about that I cannot wait to watch. And this is a book that I will definitely be going back to reread many times, I hope, in the future. And that is Shogun by James Clavell. And if you guys are sick and tired of me talking about this book already, I'm sorry, but I loved it. This book is literally 1 page shy of 1,300 pages. And man, other than chapter 40, if you know, you know, this book deserved every single one of those 1,300 pages. I'm not going to try to say that this is, you know, there aren't some slower sections or there's some parts where I got a little confused and had to work harder at keeping things straight because there's a lot of different political sects and factions and families and things in feudal Japan to keep track of in this story. But man, like... this book deserves the 1,300 pages, and it is one of the books that I think I can say the most confidently deserves every page, except for chapter 40, that was written in it. And the nice part about Shogun, and this is something that I really encourage people with, if this looks intimidating to you, I completely understand that. However, if you notice these tabs here, the book is actually separated into parts. So what we did for our buddy read is that we did 1 part every month, or a couple of parts every month, but essentially a third-ish of the book every month, and then we talked about it. And that worked so well for this book because it did not feel overwhelming. It really broke the book up into some manageable sections. But to be totally honest, this is not a hard book to read. I would encourage you guys to try it, especially if you have been watching the new Shogun series and you haven't picked up the book yet. I promise you, please check out the book because it is not as intimidating as it looks, and I am 100% in the camp that it deserves all 1,300 pages of its chonkiness. So those are the most chonky books that I have ever read and how I felt about them. So overall, I feel pretty good with most of them. And obviously, the thing is, when you have a book that's that long, you're probably going to have some sections that might be a little slower than others, but that's okay because that is very natural storytelling. And in most of these books, that's a good thing. The fact that there are different paces throughout the book, there's kind of peaks and valleys, there are sections where we get to take a little bit of a breath and have a moment of normalcy before we rush back into the action. But yeah, I would love to know what the longest books you have ever read are and whether or not you thought that they deserved the page count they were given. Please let me know down in the comments. Also check the description box for all of my links. If you liked the video, like and subscribe to support the channel, and I really appreciate you watching. I hope you're having a great week. I hope you're reading some 5-star reads, and I will see you in the next video.